June 6th, 1992. Springfield, Missouri. 19-year-old Suzie Streeter and 18-year-old Stacy McCall just graduated high school, and like most young people, they were eager to head on to the next chapters of their lives and to close the book on possibly the first large portion of them. In an effort to make the most of the night and celebration, Suzie and Stacy would go to numerous parties and make plans with their other friend to go to an amusement park in Branson, Missouri, approximately 45 minutes away. Suzie and Stacy would decide to go and spend the night with Suzie's mother, Sherill Levitt, and then leave in the morning. However, once Suzie and Stacy left their friends that night, they would never be seen again, and neither would Sherill Levitt. All three women seemingly vanished from Levitt's home on 1717 East Delmar Street in Springfield. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, a missing persons enigma, chock full of questions and unsolved clues. What happened to the three women who became known as the Springfield Three? Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host Dominic, and today on the show we have an episode that I have planned on doing for quite some time, and to be honest, I kind of procrastinated on this one, and that's on me. I remember mentioning this episode quite a while back and kind of, hinting and saying that I was going to drop this episode only for me to pivot to other episode topics, so this one has been quite a long time coming in the grand scheme of things. Now, before we get started, if anyone has done any research or anything like that into high-profile missing persons cases, this one stands up there pretty high and is a big one, and is for a multitude of reasons. The idea that these three women seemingly disappeared off the face of the earth and that we have basically no witnesses, very few suspects, and very few bits of tangible evidence that we can even go on makes this case very difficult to solve. And the fact that whatever happened to these girls could very well have been committed by anyone, and that we have genuinely no idea who this person or persons could be. Of course, we have some guesses and theories about possible suspects that we will dive into at the very end. But this case, to me, is a lot like the case of Maura Murray that I actually covered back in Season 1. We know we have kind of a very rough outline and timeline of events, yet very little information is known about key periods of time, and unfortunately that leads us to this massive dead end when it comes to finding the whereabouts of Suzie Streeter, Stacy McCall, and Sherill Levitt. Now, before we dive into the case, let's talk about where this story takes place. Springfield, Missouri. Now, Springfield, Missouri is sometimes referred to as the Queen City of the Ozarks. It is the third most populated city within Missouri. Springfield has a deep-rooted history of America in the 1800s, widely thought to be named from settlers who migrated from the city sharing the same name of Springfield, Massachusetts. However, that idea has been hotly debated, with some people claiming that the area around Springfield and where it would be established contained a spring on top of the hill within the town, and the large principal area of the city happened to reside on the field on top of said hill. Spring, field. Pretty cut and dry. Others point to a possible correlation with the town of Springfield, Tennessee, which is obviously closer in proximity. Now, the area that would become Springfield was first really inhabited by the Osage Nation of Native Americans, and if I pronounce that wrong, I do apologize. It was also inhabited by the Kickapoo people as well, who immigrated from regions of Indiana. Now, these Native American tribes, their reasons for moving were mainly to try and avoid the fast-pushing expanse of the American settlers coming in from Europe. Now, Springfield, Missouri, the town, had a tumultuous history throughout the Civil War, and eventually many of the Native American people who had moved to the area were forced out anyway from said European settlers. As time went on, and we move to the present day, Springfield is widely considered not to be a city, but rather a very large town because of its suburb-like nature, rolling hills, numerous bodies of water, and large patches of forested land. Now, it is the current home of Missouri State University, and back in 1992, it just happened to be the home of Sherill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall. Suzie Streeter, full name Suzie Streeter, and her mother Sherill Levitt would live on the 1700 block of East Delmar Street in Springfield, more importantly, 1717 East Delmar Street. Sherill Levitt had previously been married twice to her first husband, in which she took the name Streeter, and had 2 children, Suzie and her brother Bart. However, that marriage wouldn't last incredibly long, and they decided to head their separate ways. But from all accounts, it seems to be a very neutral split, a very amicable one, and there wasn't any malice towards Sherill or the children from Sherill's ex-husband. Eventually, Sherill would remarry a man named Don Levitt, and obviously take his surname, but they would end up getting divorced as well. Now, this divorce mostly stemmed from a failed business practice from Don, which ended up taking a toll on the relationship, as Sherill would be heckled pretty frequently from people that Don owed money to. Suzie, during this period, from what I could find, were just kind of very neutral towards her stepfather, Don Levitt, but for the longest time, it was really just Suzie and her mother, Sherill, and of course, because of this, they were extremely close with one another. Now, Stacy and Suzie were arguably best friends, and they both went to high school together at Kickapoo High School in Springfield. After graduating from Kickapoo High School, they decided to celebrate by spending their time, by going to a couple parties around the Springfield area with their friends. Of course, this makes sense. You just graduated high school, a lot of people would do that. It's a very common thing to do. Now, after spending some time at these parties, they had made plans to head to the Whitewater Amusement Park in the following morning in nearby Branson, Missouri, and that they were meeting a fellow classmate, Janelle Kirby, and her boyfriend there. Now, originally, they decided to actually stay at Janelle Kirby's house that night on the 6th, after a party at another classmate's house got broken up. Stacy's mother, Janice McCall, recalls talking to Stacy that night, and Stacy told her that they weren't heading out for Whitewater Amusement Park until the morning, which Janice felt like was a good thing, given that they were at parties all night, and she didn't really like the idea of them driving late at night. Now, while at Janelle Kirby's house, the pair, Suzie and Stacy, decide that Janelle's house is a little too crowded for them personally, as Janelle had some family friends over, and, Suzie and Stacy's like, there's not too much room for us here, we kind of feel like we're bothering everybody. How about instead we head back to Suzie's house? And they decided to do that. Now, Suzie's house on East Delmar Street was approximately 10 to 15 minutes away from Janelle Kirby's house. Now, Suzie had said that they had just bought a new waterbed at her house and that they would be much more comfortable there, and this was obviously a motivating factor as to why the pair decided to leave Janelle Kirby's house. Now, by the time they had left the house of Janelle Kirby, it was roughly 2 a.m. that morning, which would put this on June 7th, of course. Now, which then would put them at the home of Suzie and her mom, Sherill, at around 2:15 a.m.-ish. Now, when the following morning arrived, Janelle and her boyfriend, Mike Henson, would end up traveling to the home of Suzie and Sherill, as Suzie and Stacy hadn't shown up to Janelle Kirby's house that morning to take the trip to Whitewater in Branson. Initially, the pair of Janelle and Mike thought this was extremely odd, but also perhaps they thought the duo had just simply overslept. Again, they were out till 2 o'clock in the morning. It kind of makes sense if they overslept, and that could be why they weren't answering their phones. However, when Janelle and Mike arrived at the home, they had noticed Suzie, Stacy, and Cheryl's car all in the driveway. However, later one friend who visited the house shortly after Mike and Janelle said that Suzie's car was not where it normally would be parked, as she would pull straight into the carport on the house, and that's not where she was, which, of course, could mean a variety of things. It could mean that someone else was there at the time that the girls had arrived that night. However, no one really knows this for certain. Now, when Mike and Janelle went to investigate the house and to try and find the girls, they had noticed that before they had walked into the home, there was a porch light shattered on the porch, and there was glass everywhere. Now, I have seen 2 different accounts of what Mike did next. Now, one source I found said that Janelle and Mike cleaned up the glass on the porch because that's what Suzie and Sherill would have wanted, because Suzie would have not liked the porch all messy like that. But I also found that Janelle was actually barefoot, and Mike did not want Janelle to step on the broken glass or walk across the porch and, again, risk stepping on broken glass. And both of these points could be valid, and both of these points could be true. I've just saw both of them, so I felt the need to list both of them as well. However, in doing this, in Mike Henson sweeping up the glass on the porch, Mike and Janelle would unknowingly sweep up perhaps the largest piece of evidence available to investigators, and that being the only visible sign of a struggle that would be found at the home of Suzie Streeter and Sherill Levitt. When Janelle and Mike entered the home, they didn't notice much out of the ordinary, and just that the three girls weren't there. However, what was the family dog Cinnamon, who, when seeing Mike and Janelle, greeted the pair and kind of seemed to be worked up or agitated, and Mike and Janelle couldn't really figure out why. Mike and Janelle saw that the three women were nowhere to be found in the house, and even though that stood out as really, really odd, it initially didn't sound the alarm off in their heads quite yet. Now, while exploring the house, the home phone would ring. When Janelle would answer the phone, the voice on the other line would go on to make a variety of sexual innuendos to Janelle. According to Springfield Police Sergeant David Asher, the phone call was, and I quote, obscene. The individual would not identify himself. They were using the F word and several other words, and she just hung up the phone. Now, when Janelle hung up the phone, the caller would call back a second time and made similar comments. Janelle would go on to state that the caller sounded teenish. Now, it is also widely regarded that there was a voicemail left on the phone in the Levitt home from this supposed prank caller, or so we think, but I'll touch on this on whether or not that this caller, this voicemail that was left on the answering machine, had anything to do with the case. And as it turns out, this kind of prank call that Janelle Kirby received, the Levitt home had actually received these similar prank calls before. You know, this kind of teenager on the other line making these really kind of sexual, inappropriate jokes. It turns out the Levitt home had received those before, and the police actually don't think these calls were connected to the case at all. They think these are very separate, and they think that this is just a prank caller who was doing this as a way to get a ruse out of somebody. However, after all of this, and after investigating the house, Janelle and Mike thought it was odd that all three women were seemingly nowhere to be found. However, like I mentioned, they didn't sound the alarm bell quite yet. They just decided to go to a different amusement park called Hydro Slide in Springfield rather than travel all the way to Branson without Suzie and Stacy. Now, it wouldn't be until a few hours later when Janice McCall, Stacy's mother, grew concerned that she had not heard from Stacy. Knowing that Stacy had spent the night at Suzie's home, that is where she started and made her way over to the Levitt household. When Janice arrived at the house, she had also noticed the cars still parked in the driveway, and Cinnamon, the family dog, was still acting agitated and upset, which she also observed as being quite odd. Upon further investigation of the house, she had noticed the three girls' purses neatly lined up next to each other. Sherill had roughly $800 to $900 in her purse, which is presumed to be income she had made at the salon in which she had worked at. Suzie's bedroom contained Stacy's change of clothes, which was neatly folded in the room. The bedroom TV was playing Static Snow, implying they must have used it at some point during the night, whether it was to watch TV or play a movie or whatever it was. It seems that they had used the television over the course of the night. Also in the home, their jewelry and keys were still there, as well as Sherill and Suzie's cigarettes being left behind in the house as well, and a half-empty can of Coke next to said cigarettes. Now, what is particularly odd here was those who were close to Sherill and Suzie say the tidbit of them leaving behind their cigarettes was incredibly odd, as Sherill was a chain smoker, and she wouldn't go anywhere without her cigarettes. And it seems like Suzie, being so close with her mother, picked up on this habit as well, and was also an avid smoker, and reportedly wouldn't go anywhere without her cigarettes either. Now, before Janice left the home, she would go to the telephone and call the police and tell them about the three missing women. While being there on the phone, this is where the voicemail comes back into play. There was that voicemail left on the machine, and that Janice played said voicemail. However, it is widely believed that through some way, shape, or form, this voicemail was different, and it was not connected to the prank phone calls Janelle Kirby received while at the home, and that this message was different. However, somehow, this message got erased from the machine. So whatever clue that voicemail might contain is unfortunately lost forever. Now, Suzie and Stacy were supposedly last seen on Battlefield Road headed towards Suzie's home on East Delmar Street at around 2 a.m., and Sherill was last known to be talking to somebody on the phone at around 11:15 p.m. which gives us a rough estimate of their moves for that night. However, what happened between the 2 a.m. to 8 a.m. time frame is the total mystery, as no one seems to account for their whereabouts during that time period. Now, we do have a supposed sighting at a 24/7 diner in Springfield that supposedly puts the three women there at the diner between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. Now, the waitress working at this diner would go on to say that there would be two younger women who came in, one blonde, which would be Suzie, and one brunette, which would be Stacy, with an older woman who we have to presume is Sherill. Now, this woman described Suzie as reporting to be acting intoxicated and was very giddy, while the older woman, who we have to presume is Sherill, was trying to calm her down, while the third woman, Stacy, remained quiet. Now, we also have a gas station attendant named Stephen Thompson, who came forward and claimed to see a woman matching Cheryl's description come into his mini-mart at around 2 a.m. And this mini-mart just happens to be 4.5 miles away from the Levitt Streeter residence. Now, police have stated that Stephen Thompson's account has been verified and contains some veracity to it, some truthfulness to it. But many doubt that happened to be Sherill running around that late at night. And many family and friends that knew her have stated, and I quote, "For her to be out at 2 in the morning, just whistling in the wind, or whatever, that's just nuts. The only way she would go out like that is if somebody called her and said Suzie needed her." Now, if these accounts are accurate, it does mess up the timeline a little bit. And let's just say the 24/7 diner was a legit sighting. That would still leave the woman unaccounted for from roughly 3 a.m. to 8 a.m., which is still 5 whole hours of not knowing what could have happened. But for now, let's get back to the house. While waiting for the police to arrive, numerous people stopped by the East Delmar Street home trying to figure out where the three women had gone. Concerned family and friends flocked to the house, and many of them, when discovering the door was unlocked, much like Janelle Kirby, Mike Hansen, and Janice McCall did, they took it upon themselves to investigate, which, looking back on, meant that possibly numerous people went inside and possibly contaminated a crime scene. Now, by the time the police were fully involved with the scene and that they knew the three girls had been missing, it was about 9 p.m. on June 7th, almost a full day after they had last been seen or heard from. When police arrived on scene at the East Delmar residence, they were well behind the curb. Of course, at this point, so many people had gone through the crime scene, and it was hard to make out what was what. Authorities did a canvass of the area with nothing to show for it. In addition to that, no one around the area of the East Delmar Street residence had seen or heard anything during the hours between 2 a.m. and 8 a.m. that morning, including a newspaper carrier who went by the house during this time period said that they did not hear anything or see anything that would indicate a struggle of any sort. Again, it is possible that the crime was committed well before this newspaper carrier had passed. The police did find something of note, though. Upon investigation of the house, they had noticed that Cheryl's room was in a slight state of disarray, and anyone who knew Sherill said that this was very out of character for her, and that she was a bit of a neat freak. Another thing to note was the bedroom window shade in Cheryl's room was slightly raised, almost if it was raised if someone was using it to peer out from. Now, Cheryl's bed also looked like it had been slept in, and it was a little unkempt, leading investigators to wonder if whatever had happened to the girls had happened shortly after they had woken up, or something had woken them up. But again, that is just speculation. In the following days, all three of the women would not show up for work, and any hope that family and friends had of them turning up that way was lost. Police were searching leads that they had, but they had very, very little to go on. Essentially, the case was cold before it ever began. This disappearance gripped the Springfield community for a very long time, and as the time faded, the families of Sherill, Stacy, and Suzie were trying to understand what had happened that night. Now, it has been over 3 decades since the three women went missing that night, and so far we still don't know if the police have had any substantial breakthroughs in the case. Some information from the case has remained sealed and unknown to the public. While some suspects' information has been given to the public, it allows us to make the speculations and hopefully connect the dots on who could have committed this crime and where it takes us. Which it takes us into our suspects section. Now, before we dive into our suspects section, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere, and I will be right back. Welcome back. Now, in doing my research for this episode, the suspects list is long, and rightfully so. And each suspect has a slightly different background than the others. And in some cases of these suspects, the suspect claims to have knowledge about where the three women could be located, but have never come forward to the police with that information. With that being said, let's dive into our very first suspect. Now, our first suspect is Bart Streeter. And Bart being, of course, Suzie's sister and Sherill's son. Now, on the surface, you might think that this isn't a viable suspect, and that is where the police would disagree with you. Early on in the investigation, authorities looked at Bart and his slightly estranged relationship he had from his mother and sister. Bart was a rebel soul growing up, and when he was 17 years old, he would move out of the family home and try and go on and strike it on his own. His aunt described the people he would hang out with as quote-unquote lowlifes, and that Bart was a toxic personality. People magazine investigates looked into Bart as a suspect and reported that he supposedly had a violent temper towards his family and lashed out at Sherill in the past, and this caused him, in a sense, to be ousted and disinherited by the family at that time. Approximately a year before Sherill and Suzie would go missing, Bart would try and mend the situation with Sherill and Suzie. Suzie, of course, was more receptive to Bart trying to be a brother again, and Suzie was excited to have him back around, while Sherill had her doubts, and rightfully so. Suzie, on the other hand, decided to actually go and stay with Bart for a time over the summer before her senior year in high school. However, Bart would start slipping back into a drinking habit he had developed, and one night while spending time at Bart's house, Suzie would ask Bart to turn down his stereo, as she thought it was too loud, and Bart actually got pissed and pushed Suzie to the ground. Fast forward to June of 1992, that family bond had not healed, and Bart was still an outcast from the family. When the girls disappeared, Bart was extensively questioned, and Bart said that on the night they disappeared, that he was out drinking with a neighbor and had left his house at approximately 11 p.m. to midnight that night of the disappearance, and he drank enough to the point by the time he had gotten home, he had actually just straight up passed out. Now, Bart would go on to pass a polygraph test, but again, that is kind of shaky, especially considering if Bart had a drinking problem and could have been intoxicated during the time of the polygraph, which means that there's no way that the polygraph is accurate. Now, I have my love-hate relationship with polygraph machines, and many people who investigate true crime do as well. Obviously, polygraph machines now cannot be looked at as viable forms of evidence, as there are ways to fake them, there are ways to kind of get around them, and kind of everything like that. But I kind of digress on the polygraph test. But Bart, in my eyes, does not pose a threat as a viable suspect. But of course, that is just my opinion. Over the course of the years after the investigation, he would occasionally make appearances and speak to investigators and check in on the case while he lived in the Springfield area in the years afterwards. However, he would have a run-in with the law in 2019 that would paint him in a very bad light. In Smyrna, Tennessee, and I think I pronounced that right, Smyrna, that S-M-Y-R-N-A, Smyrna. Any listeners from Tennessee, if I pronounce that wrong, please tell me the right way to say it. I think I pronounced it right. Now, in Smyrna, Tennessee, Bart would walk into a salon intoxicated and supposedly try and take a girl that he thought was his granddaughter and take her with him. Of course, this young girl had no idea who Bart was and resisted. The police would be called and Bart would be arrested. However, the Streeter family would advocate that this entire situation was a misunderstanding, as the footage from the salon shows Bart walking into the salon, shaking the hand of the owner, and asking if the granddaughter in the salon was a patron, and that there was no attempted kidnapping. Now, everyone acknowledges Bart's alcohol abuse and the idea that he's got some sort of problem, but the idea that he could have had something to do with his mother and sister's disappearance seems very unlikely. Our second suspect is Stephen Garrison. Stephen Garrison was a career criminal with ties to the Galloping Goose Motorcycle Club. And unlike many other motorcycle clubs, this one is the bad kind of motorcycle club, not the one that wears, sure, they wear the leather jackets, but this isn't the leather jacket kind that kind of rides your bikes around and, helps old ladies cross the street. This is the type of cliche motorcycle club that deals meth. And for lack of a better word, that is exactly what they did. Stephen Garrison had originally been serving a 2 to 10 year sentence for theft and burglary in Kansas in 1990. And instead of serving out the remainder of his sentence, he had a genius idea. When he had 2 weeks left, he would escape prison with a fellow inmate and take refuge in Springfield, Missouri. Eventually, police would discover Stephen Garrison's whereabouts and bring him back into custody, and was reincarcerated and stayed there until May of 1992, only a few weeks before the disappearance of the Springfield Three. Now, we have to assume a career criminal like Garrison quickly went back to crime after he got out in 1992, and that would be right. In January of 1993, he would be arrested for having a gun and narcotics on him, which, as a felon, would instantly send him back to the clink. Now, this is when things get interesting. Stephen Garrison would come forward to police and claim to have some type of knowledge about what happened to the 3 missing women. Now, it is unknown whether or not Stephen Garrison was using this as some sort of ploy to try and get his gun and narcotics charges lowered and get his sentencing reduced, but regardless, this was as physical of a lead as the police were going to get at the time, so they pursued it. Now, Stephen Garrison would point the police to a farm owned by the Robb family in a neighboring county, and they would end up searching that farm. However, the results of that search have never fully been disclosed to the public and have been on a gag order. Now, Stephen Garrison is currently in prison, I believe, for a separate crime he would commit after confessing to the police and being found guilty for a separate rape case. Now, it is widely regarded that the 3 women's disappearance could be tied to something in a sexual manner. Now, of course, there is no way to confirm this, but it seems to be the direction that law enforcement kind of think it goes. Now, is there any direct involvement or evidence linking Garrison? Perhaps not, but many people think that the fact that the police have not released any information about the searches conducted at the Robb farm makes many internet sleuths thinking that he could have some type of involvement, and that this evidence about the location of where the 3 women could be credible. For now, it's impossible to say. However, Stephen Garrison remains a top suspect. Our third suspect is Gerald Carnahan. Now, Gerald Carnahan is an interesting subject. The origin of Carnahan as a potential suspect didn't happen initially, and took a few years for him to emerge as a very possible party responsible for the 3 women's disappearance. However, that is very, very hard to say whether or not he was. Carnahan has already been convicted, and at the time, it was currently in jail he is in jail, for a sexual assault and murder case of Jackie Johns, a teenage girl and pageant winner who Carnahan preyed upon. Now, for years, the Jackie Johns case was unproven. They thought it was Gerald Carnahan, and the investigators knew it, but they couldn't connect him to the case. The only bit of evidence they had at the time was a DNA swab, which they took at the time of the crime in 1985. Now, DNA evidence back then wasn't as valuable as it was now, when DNA evidence, of course, took the turn at the start of the 21st century. In 2010, that DNA would be tested and come to a match of Gerald Carnahan. While running free of the murder of Jackie Johns, Gerald Carnahan would run into the law again. So this is actually, he would commit the murder of Jackie Johns, and while he had not yet been found guilty, he would go in to commit other crimes, and he would get arrested for attempted kidnapping of an 18-year-old girl, and he would be found guilty of that, and that would be in 1993. Now, Gerald Carnahan was a Springfield native, and he would have been in the area the night the 3 women's disappearance. But to me, Gerald Carnahan seems like a proximity suspect. Like, he just happens to be in the area, so we have to point a finger at him and say, hey, he could have something to do with it. However, even if he did, and maybe he did, I mean, maybe this is me just being doubtful, there is no evidence pointing towards Gerald Carnahan. That makes me think maybe it was him. And in my opinion, I am more willing to go with maybe that it was somebody else rather than Gerald Carnahan, because there just doesn't seem any motive. It just seems like To me, Gerald Carnahan preyed upon these girls who were traveling solo. To me, Suzie and Stacy were traveling together. They'd go back to her mother's house. It's all three women, and to me, it just does not scream Gerald Carnahan. But again, this is me just speculating. This is my own personal opinion, and I guess take that with a grain of salt. Now, our next suspect is Robert Craig Cox. Now, he is perhaps the favorite suspect at this current point in time. And in 1992, Robert Craig Cox was back in his hometown of Springfield after being cleared due to a lack of evidence from previous offenses of stalking and kidnapping young women. While living in Springfield, he was in the area during the disappearance and at first wasn't a suspect. Just someone who would happen to be in the area and had a past record. And because there was nothing connecting him to the crime or any motive, nobody really suspected anything else. Again, you're going off of evidence, and the reality with the Springfield Three case is there's just so little evidence. However, Robert Craig Cox would go on to commit another crime in 1995 down in Texas, in which he was arrested for armed robbery. Now, they also affiliate him with another crime in which a woman in Plano was stalked on her way home, and that a man tried to enter her home, and it was believed that this man was Robert Craig Cox. But investigators determined, rather than pursuing Cox for this kind of stalking case and this attempted assault, or however be it, they had enough evidence to convict him on the armed robbery case. So at this point, they said, hey, let's get him off the street, let's convict him on the armed robbery case, and let's put him behind bars. Now, once doing so, at this time, he had popped back on the radar of the investigators in Missouri looking into the Springfield Three case. In January of 1996, while in Texas prison, Springfield police traveled down to him to speak to him in person, and what Robert Craig Cox told police reportedly was new information, and information which could not eliminate him as a suspect. Robert Cox would go on also during this interview with police, he would speak highly of Ted Bundy, who he had actually met while sitting in Florida prison in the years prior, and actually stated he looked up to Ted Bundy and thought the two shared a lot of similarities. Needless to say, Robert Craig Cox is whacked. He would also go on to conduct an interview with the Springfield News leader in which he would tell the newspaper that he had knowledge about where the three women were buried and that they would, quote-unquote, never be found, but that their bodies were buried in Springfield and that he could find them. Now, Cox was living in the Springfield area and did and does have a weak alibi for the night the three women went missing, as during the hours of 2:30 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. on the night of the three women's disappearance, he said he got home after a late night and went to bed. His parents confirmed this, even though they were sleeping at the time, so they really couldn't confirm this. You also have his girlfriend at the time coming out and backing up this alibi as well, but it turns out she lied on behalf of Robert Craig Cox. Robert Craig Cox had a laundry list of priors when it comes to stalking women, harassment, and murder, and is also a prime suspect in the case of the I-70 killer. Not to be mistaken with the I-70 strangler, mind you, which I also did a previous episode on. Cox would further add fuel to the fire that he had some sort of involvement with the case when he told police that he theorized that Suzie and Stacy were not the primary targets on the night the three women disappeared, but rather just Sherill. And saying, and I quote, "I think they just happened to get caught up. They weren't supposed to be there. Situation change." Now, even though there was this quote-unquote situation change, Robert Craig Cox would also say that even if the crime was committed by a single person, it would be very easy to control the three women with a firearm, by stating, and I quote, "It's very easy to control three people when somebody comes into the room with a gun. The common person will follow what direction they're led. The common person." Close quote. Now, to this day, it is unclear whether Robert Craig Cox had any involvement in the case. However, what he told investigators, that we don't know, because that information has never been released to us, when he was visited in Texas prison in 1996. Now, the statement to the Springfield News leader in the comments about the women he made make us think one of two things. One, being he's fucking crazy, and two, being he did it. Maybe perhaps both. But there's no evidence to prove it. So either he is just toying with police, or he is trying to lure them away from somebody else as a potential suspect. If you ask me, I think there's validity in both statements, that he is A, fucking crazy, and he's trying to lead the police on this wild goose chase. Or he actually did it and is smart enough to know that there's no evidence, so he's just fucking around with the police. And I think you could go either which way on that. Now, another suspect I want to go into is Larry Dwayne Hall. Larry Hall was a serial killer who traveled all throughout the Midwest preying on his victims. Now, the only thing connecting Larry Hall with the disappearance of the three women was that he had initially been and confessed to the killing of the three women, but would later recant his statement. Now, Larry Hall is currently serving life behind bars for a plethora of crimes committed against young women, and Suzie and Stacy would definitely fit in this profile. However, like all these other suspects, there is no evidence connecting Hall to the case other than the fake confession. But could he have just done the fake confession as some type of red herring to mislead investigators who were looking for the real culprit? Who knows? This whole situation with Larry Hall is odd, but again, there is no evidence connecting Larry Hall to the case whatsoever. Now, our last possible suspect here is an ex-boyfriend. Now, another popular theory is that one of Suzie's ex-boyfriends could have been responsible. Suzie had a thing for dating quote-unquote bad boys. That was in my research. That's not my words. And that this was widely talked about among social circles at the time, with her two previous ex-boyfriends, one being Dustin Rekla, who was a convicted grave robber, and Mike Kovacs, who had a criminal past, and Suzie actually had to get a restraining order against him, as Mike would be harassing her. However, that was in the year prior of the three women's disappearance, and from all accounts, even though Suzie had gotten the restraining order, there was no malice from Mike. Now, do I think that one of these two men could have done it? I'm not really sure. If anything, to me, they would just be targeting Suzie, so it wouldn't make any sense for them to go after all three women if that happened to be the case. And if they were looking for a good time to commit the crime, they wouldn't follow the women home to have there be another potential witness. At that point, it doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't buy the theory that this was an ex-boyfriend. But if anything, Mike Kovacs would be the one to do it if I had to pick one, just because of the history with the restraining order. But even then, I think that thought process might be a little bit of a reach. Now, with all the suspects being laid out, I want to give my own personal thoughts and opinion on this case and kind of a little timeline I threw together. Again, this is my own personal thoughts. This is my own personal timeline. Take everything with a grain of salt. Of course, I am not a crime scene investigator. I am not anything. I'm a guy who talks into a microphone and hopes that people enjoy what I have to say. So, again, take that all with a grain of salt. However, this is my own personal opinion on the case and said timeline. I think the girls left Janelle Kirby's house that night and went home. Now, clearly, there was evidence they stayed the night at the East Delmar home. Now, when it comes to the sighting of Sherill at the gas station and the three women at the diner, like the waitress saw, perhaps the girls got sidetracked and one thing led to another, and Suzie was intoxicated in some way from the night of partying. Stacy could have gotten a hold of Suzie's mom, or maybe Suzie had called her mother while intoxicated. This would lead the three girls meeting up at the diner where they all ate, to hopefully sober Suzie up a little bit before driving back home, not wanting to risk getting pulled over. Once done, they leave the diner, head back to the house, and go to bed. The girls try to maybe pull an all-nighter and watch a movie or TV, but can't. And this accounts for the TV being discovered snowy. At some point over the course of the night, perhaps either a car drove into the driveway or someone posing as a utility worker, which, before I continue, seems to be a running theory as to how the intruder was able to get the women's attention, as that perhaps could be the only thing that the women would have been alerted to and listened to at that hour of the night, especially if this person posing as this utility worker made up a convincing story about some type of utility work needing to get done. Now, this person, when pulling into the driveway or posing as said utility worker, woke up Sherill first, as evident with her bedroom shade being raised and her bed unkempt, meaning she got out of bed to investigate first. Upon heading to the door, this is when the attacker sprang into action and rounded up the 2 other girls from their beds and from their sleeping and took them hostage and kidnapped them. Now, of course, that would explain that why all of their stuff was left behind, why their cigarettes were left behind, and obviously the TV being staticky, snowy means, of course, in my opinion, they were trying to watch something, passed out from just pure exhaustion. Sherill got up first, went to investigate. This person confronted Sherill at the door, either overpowered her or took her hostage, then rounded the 2 girls up. And obviously took them wherever they unfortunately ended up. Now, who do I think was the intended target? I honestly have no idea. And it might be impossible to know if Suzie was the intended target of this person who had took the women, or we have to assume took the women, whether maybe Stacy was the intended target or Sherill. We have no idea, and we can theorize for hours on who this could possibly be, but we just end up going around in circles, to be honest. Now, if I were to bet, the killer was either Robert Craig Cox, just because of the pure amount of information he said that he knew and kind of the cryptic weird shit that he was saying in terms of the case. Or perhaps it is somebody completely unknown and someone completely off the radar of investigators, people like me who talk about it on the internet, and police, FBI. It's some suspect that is completely unknown. And very often, it ends up being that case. And it ends up being someone outside of the initial theories and suspects list that commits these virtually unsolvable cases. And you see that still with unsolved cases that end up being solved after years and years of remaining cold. Unfortunately, the case of the Springfield Three, due to the lack of evidence, the deleted phone message, the constant contact people had with the crime scene, and the lack of evidence left behind, has hampered the investigation tenfold. All we need to do now is hope and pray that there is a new lead, or perhaps a confession from someone in regards to the case for these women's families to finally get closure after all these years. But with that being said, that is today's episode on the Springfield Three. I hope I rounded it all up there. I hope it gave you plenty of information. Of course, there is a whole lot more information that I could not fill into this episode, but I think I got 99% of it and kind of condensed it into this package for you all to listen and enjoy too. But with that being said, I have teased and anticipated this episode for so long, and I do apologize that it's taken me so long to put this episode out. That is on me. Again, I procrastinated, and I own up to that completely. But with that being said, this is the end of the episode, so I do my obligatory plugs that I do every single week. If you are listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you are listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out greatly, and I appreciate it. Go ahead and follow me on TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown, where I post 1-minute breakdowns of the episodes that I do. Now, in addition to that, you are more than welcome to send me topic suggestions. And again, I said for Christmas, the best Christmas gift you could get me was a topic suggestion. I still mean that. Give me the gift of a topic suggestion. It helps me out, and it's living proof that I do them. Previous episodes I have been topic suggestions. Send them over to me. Send them over to my email, unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. Send them to me via Instagram direct message. You're more than welcome to do that as well. Send them to me. I look into them, I add them to the episode queue, and I do get to them, I promise. But with all that being said, I really appreciate you tuning in to this week's episode, and I will see you all on the next one.